I grew up watching a lot of cartoons. A big chunk of them were stylized, relatively mature pieces like Samurai Jack, Star Wars The Clone Wars, or Batman the Animated Series. Others were colorful pulp like Brave and the Bold or Codename Kid Next Door. I think all of them were at least kind of formative, but when I look back on the cartoon trash and treasure that I consumed, a few shows jump out at me every single time. One specific show taught me a very specific lesson. And that very specific lesson is that being different kind of kicks ass. In my rampage through Disney Plus, I've found that this show is still great, despite not quite holding up as well as I remembered. X-Men has remained my favorite Marvel property, hands down, especially as superhero cinema has become such a cultural staple. It's a shame to see the other Marvel IPs getting increasingly watered down, messy, or lost, or else just evolving into barely concealed propaganda. So many of them read as a super corporation recognizing they can print money and just sort of making whatever. See, personally, I stand in the Lindsay Ellis camp of Marvel movie opinions.
To me, they run the gamut from, it's fine, to, it's pretty good. They rarely prompt a rewatch, and they even more rarely evoke any kind of real emotional reaction in me.
But I can't really say the same about X-Men. Yes, obviously, the X-Men movies have always been a mixed bag, and the comics are just so far up their own ass, but I've always had an appreciation for the strong thematic through line of the other. Not only that, the other finding belonging or righting a personal, societal, or emotional wrong, for better and worse. And that's the thing. It's the concept of mutants as an allegory for the other that makes these stories work. And with so many characters within the pantheon, that otherness can be tailored to fit specific narratives, be they LGBTQ+, mental health, or, yes, even
dated metaphor for racism in the 60s.
And now, with all that being said, it's time to talk about Wade. Deadpool, directed by Tim Miller, debuted in 2016 and was pretty much an overnight modern classic. There'd been rumblings of a full feature since Ryan Reynolds portrayed a version of Wade in X-Men Origins, but it was really after the leaked test footage that the idea of a hard-R superhero action flick really started to enchant the popular consciousness. If 2012's Avengers was a John Wayne movie, then Deadpool was Sergio Leone with the Coen Brothers. But that countercultural nature obviously predates Reynolds. See, Deadpool was conceived by Rob Liefield as a piss take of DC Comics' Deathstroke, taking aim at the brutal and grimdark anti-heroes that were becoming increasingly oversaturated in geek culture. However, he was revolutionary in that the appeal was both surface level and academic as he became more three-dimensional. Wade is to superhero literature what Hunter S Thompson was to journalism. A batshit insane shot in the arm, a new method of presentation where a garish, freak show exterior is the means to explore incredibly existential, uncomfortable, and deep-seated questions about society and the nature of the human condition. And the reason the movie succeeds is because it expands on that. It perfectly zeroes in on two interlinked, indelible aspects of Deadpool's character: trauma and ugliness. The operative difference between Wade and your average X-Man is the idea of being damaged or hurt rather than gifted. But to determine that requires a bit of context. Wade is very obviously a man with a litany of issues and hang-ups before he undergoes what I'll be calling the activation.
Whoa, baby. Are you sure you want to shoot your whole lot?
I used to hate this initial scene with Wade and Vanessa because you can't really tell which traumatic events they mention are real and which are being exaggerated or made up, but on my rewatches, I'm not sure it matters. It's more about the performances of the two actors and the fact that both of these people have had very difficult pasts. Writing for the Mary Sue, Lindsay Ellis said of this scene, "I was molested by my uncle," says Wade in a joking, not joking manner, to which Vanessa counters in a similar fashion, "Uncles. The two then drop the facade and laugh. There seems to be a genuine moment of empathy there. Regardless as to whether or not they're telling each other the truth, this interaction is interesting because it echoes interactions I've seen in the real world. The baggage of trauma is awkward. It's difficult to let new people in on the experiences that have informed you as a person. How do you introduce someone to the fact that a terrible thing has happened to you? Easy. You joke about it. As a sexual abuse survivor myself, I'm inclined to believe in Wade's claim that he was sexually abused, especially as there's been multiple versions of Wade that have survived sexual assault in the mainstay comic continuity. But it's not that aspect of Wade's background that most permeates the film. See, there's a blink and you miss it line that has always stuck out to me, and coupled with what we already know about Wade's background as a special forces operative, it's got some interesting implications.
I tried the hero business and it left a mark.
Wade likely has PTSD. In fact, there's evidence that Wade's suffering from 4 out of the 5 essential PTSD symptom clusters, with the 5th coming after the activation, which then amplifies his pre-existing symptoms. It's kind of a double dip situation, but it serves the narrative beats. The stressor was Wade's home life and the acts he committed as a soldier. Later, as I said, it's the activation, but we'll discuss that in a minute. The second cluster is unpleasant changes in mood. Wade really does turn on a dime constantly and openly condemns himself as a bad guy, and the world is a constant stream of shittiness.
No. That I ain't.
I'm just a bad guy who gets paid to fuck up worse guys. Life is an endless series of train wrecks with only brief commercial-like breaks of happiness.
The third cluster is avoidance. Wade is clearly a heavy drinker, and over the course of the 2 films, we do see him use drink, drugs, and violence as a means to cope.
Just to wash the taste out. It's stuff to forget being so impressive.
4 is changes in reactivity. Wade is openly aggressive, hyper-aware, and is constantly engaging in risky behavior. Number 5 is intrusion symptoms, but again, I'll deal with that when we come to the activation. My point is that Wade has started out as an everyman affected by trauma, and post-activation the allegory becomes more overt. He's a stylized, exaggerated version of a person that has been deeply, deeply wounded. He's everyone that has ever used humor to cope with their own pain. His trauma has now been squared, I guess, and the film doesn't shy away from the fact that growing past damaging events is both incredibly hard and incredibly personal. This, of course, means that Wade's assertion that he's not X-Men material is absolutely correct. The rest of the X-Men have had their mutations since around puberty, so their otherness has followed them for as long as they can remember. They've been given time to adapt, to cope, to learn, to grow, and find community alongside people in similar situations. Wade has been destroyed. His life has been functionally ruined, and his mutation, as well as the trauma surrounding it, were forced upon him after he accidentally agreed to an incredibly damaging arrangement. His life has been irreversibly changed by a random turn of events and a desperate decision. If you'll pardon the metaphor, your average X-Man is someone who was born without the use of their legs, whereas Wade is someone who has lost their legs to an accident. Perhaps more accurately, if the average X-Man is someone who has struggled with depression or anxiety or any mental illness for their entire lives, Wade is someone who developed mental illness later in life via outside stimuli. And that's the main undercurrent of Wade's resistance to Colossus. Xavier's youth are gifted. Wade is damaged. Xavier's youth are taught to manage, control, and exist with their mutations. Wade is now in a situation that he didn't ask for and wants to be cured. He's not X-Men material because the X-Men are born with difficulties that they've turned into gifts, while trauma is never, ever a gift. This, of course, brings us to the activation. I do not like Mormons. Despite what their PR team or a musical or South Park would have you believe, it's fully and entirely a cult based around the financial, emotional, spiritual, and mental control of the membership base at the hands of the leaders. I don't have room enough to explain the full depth and scale of the abuse and horror that Mormonism enables, but the aspect of their conditioning that I'd most like to focus on is the mission culture. Mission trips and missionaries have been increasingly decried as modern-day colonialism, which is absolutely true, but the Mormon missions in specific are transparently a brainwashing initiative. Young men, usually about only 18, are taken from their homes to a completely different location, forfeiting their passport, identity, and birth name, as well as privacy and autonomy for 2 full years. They're cut off from family and only allowed to make contact with them for about an hour each week. Barring that, they are made to be completely immersed in the church's narrative, having no access to any information save for the cult's approved reading and religious texts. They are made to study 24/7 and are actively punished and berated if they are not converting others to the Mormon faith and saving their souls. They are made to have God and the cult be their only refuge in an incredibly jarring, isolating situation. And of course, the leadership weaponizes this to create what is essentially rabidly loyal foot soldiers and lifelong members of the cult with absolute fealty. I know this because I went on one. Without being too indiscreet, I was raised from birth in Mormonism and was strong-armed, threatened, gaslit, and otherwise manipulated into serving my time. The living conditions were hell on earth. There were 2 of us living out of the single-bedroom apartment, with our monthly allowance being around $120. That's $120 US for 2 young adults that needed food and hygiene products, gas for the car, everything. $120 a month, full stop. The apartment was lacking in clean water in addition to being covered with mold and mildew, and the windows were actually boarded up to prevent outsiders from seeing how the Mormon church treated us. We were allowed out only to preach and proselyte. I perpetually starved. I developed an eating disorder while my previous mental health issues continued to compound and weren't given treatment beyond telling me to pray and fast. I begged to leave countless times and was rejected and penalized for my lack of commitment to the cause every single time. Leaving was such a complex and difficult ordeal that I can't fully go into it here. This is all to explain how I first felt when I rewatched Deadpool upon escaping both the mission field and the cult at large, specifically in context to the activation center.
I joke away. One thing that never survives this place is a sense of humor.
I was told this, almost verbatim, by a religious leader. I have never in my life seen an on-screen representation of emotional and physical torture that so strongly mirrors the experience of being intimately tormented at the hands of an individual or an organization. The activation center is cast in horror movie colors and lighting, a dim, windowless hole where those in power can do whatever they want to their victims. And from Wade's arrival, he is subjected to full-time, round-the-clock torment under the guise of improving him, when in reality, they intend to make him a soldier, sold to the highest bidder. It rang incredibly reminiscent of religious leaders brutalizing me, but telling me it was for my spiritual betterment, that I would be blessed for enduring, when in reality it was to make sure that my loyalty to the organization and their concept of deity was unwavering. And that's why Wade's scarring is a stroke of genius. Wade, despite his healing factor, will never truly be whole again. His blistered flesh is quick shorthand for emotional, physical, or psychological nastiness that is so seared into the person that they can't ever fully recover, or at least can't ever fully forget. But at the cost of these scars, he unlocks a spectacular version of himself. A man that processes emotion immediately as it strikes him. A man that is stronger and faster than he was before. This is not to say that the trauma was good for Wade. On the contrary, it was awful, and it never should have happened. However, speaking from personal experience, traumatic experiences represent an interesting opportunity to introspect and move forward with an increased strength. I would prevent my trauma from ever happening if I had the chance, but I admit that it has allowed me to evolve into a version of myself that is inherently mightier, harder to kill, and harder to stop. I survived, and as such, I'm always going to have my own psycho-emotional version of a healing factor, at least in some capacity. Trauma can allow you to explode onto the scene as a different person, to become more in spite of your hurt rather than because of it. While this mostly remains implicit in Part 1, Blind Al elaborates on this concept really well in Part 2.
Listen to the pain. It's both history teacher and fortune teller. Pain teaches us who we are, Wade. Sometimes it's so bad we feel like we're dying. But we can't really live till we die a little, can we?
That's the thing. Wade's superpower is meant to represent the rising out of trauma. The byproduct of an increased emotional and situational pain tolerance is represented physically in Wade being able to shrug off bullets and missing limbs. This is every victim's fantasy, the wish fulfillment of being indestructible, untouchable, which is why when Wade sets out to exact revenge, it's so cathartic for the audience. The main plot line of Wade, now Deadpool, taking revenge on his tormentors and their enablers comes from samurai cinema and its evolution, the American Western. Nass even calls him cowboy a couple times. Stylized, violent tales of someone wronged or beaten down finding independence and personal affirmation. Though it's frequently via revenge, it isn't always. In True Grit, Maddie Ross is both pursuing her father's killer and actively discovering more about the nature of courage within herself, as well as the shades of gray present in the world around her. The Dollars trilogy, when viewed in chronological order, details Blondie's quest for riches and how it consistently alienates him from the people around him. He upholds his code and gets his money almost every time, but he loses allies. In Solo, a young man consistently wronged by authority throws in with dangerous men in order to finally take control of his destiny and become a more authentic version of himself. That being said, Wade's journey ticks the same boxes. Wade's only option after losing everything is to bite back, to try and reflect some small fraction of the pain he experienced back onto the people who perpetrated it.
This shit's gonna have nuts in it.
He's retaking parts of his personal identity in doing so. Francis and the rest of Wade's torturers hurt him for the sake of hurting him. So it's poetic, almost mythic justice to have Wade use his newfound capabilities to immediately begin a Django-style rampage, an eye for an eye. And that's another of the film's beating hearts, the stylized nature of the violence. It's heightened, even by superhero standards, often slipping into this dreamlike haze of Tarantino blood spatter and unapologetic spectacle. And that's where we return to our through line of trauma. Because the violence is so unreal, it allows us to sit back and enjoy it. We don't need to get caught up in the messiness of real-world murder because that guy just got turned into a rhubarb pie. We're allowed to see ourselves in Wade and our tormentors and struggles as the bad guys, which means we're allowed to cheer and clap when Wade absolutely decimates Francis. It's more than just a well-shot, well-choreographed thrill. It's another facet of the allegory that immediately speaks to the darker parts of ourselves that we're not allowed to indulge in. It's safe to say that most people have had at least one thought of striking back, of dropping the pretenses of being collected and just going apeshit on someone that slighted you. It's universal, and that's why the action scenes never feel out of place. They're spaced out enough that it doesn't cheapen them, but they're so fantasy fulfilling that we never quite get tired of them either. Another good example of this is Kill Bill. Yes, from the get-go, we are riffing on classic martial arts B-movies, but we're also meant to understand that this is an elevated version of reality. Kill Bill, much like the Deadpool movies, is a superhero western. It's a place where people can do the jumps from Crouching Tiger, they can redirect projectiles midair and breakdance with enough precision to remove the legs of like 8 guys, and I lose my shit at this every time. Blood sprays like a fountain, or else it's flowing like wine. People engage in elaborate sword fights on narrow beams, and this chick gets thrown into a table and it makes a bowling ball noise. But through all this absurd carnage, what we're really doing is following the bride's emotional journey, as she comes to terms with what's been inflicted on her. That is, as she finds her new identity as both entirely feminine and entirely unstoppable. On the other side of the coin, Wade's violent rampage has a sobering implication. We're meant to understand that his actions, while fun to watch, are immature and, reckless. He's trying to affirm his identity, but by putting himself and others in danger, he's given in to a juvenile, self-destructive side of himself. This is where the 5th PTSD symptom shows itself. Intrusion. The framing conceit of the entire film is that Wade, aware that he's in a movie, is sort of pseudo-editing the whole thing. He's the one recounting his experiences, but the majority of it is out of order. A few scenes are even interrupted by other portions of the story, not just in a non-linear way, but in an intrusive one. Like, if you go to the Wikipedia page for this movie and you look at the plot summary, they've laid it out in the order that it happens. It's a pretty self-contained, short story, but obviously in Wade's telling, that doesn't come across. We never see Wade experience a nightmare, but we see stylized versions of flashbacks. We see present-day Wade comment on the traumatic events as they're happening. The jumbled nature of Wade's retelling reads to me as his own brain scrambling events as a defense mechanism. I don't know if that was the intention of the filmmakers, as Wade's fourth wall breaks have obviously been a part of the character from the beginning, but it fits. It's subtle, but it works. I don't even really have that much more to say about it. Just that the unicorn cutaway is super unnecessary, and the fact that we cut to the laundromat twice kicks ass.
And I share that home with someone you've met, the old blind lady from the laundromat, Al.
God, I miss cocaine.
Her. Fourth wall break inside a fourth wall break. That's like 16 walls.
Like, this is easily Reynolds' best performance. Make no mistake, Wade's projecting a persona as Deadpool, and it's an immature one at that. It's all parts crass escapism when he puts on the mask, but he only has passing moments of obnoxiousness when he takes it off. He's still the same person, sure, but the increased anonymity grants him more confidence. Again, riffing on the Western, Wade is a man that was presumed dead, and then he uses that to operate free of scrutiny or threat of discovery. If Wade is John Reed, then Deadpool is the Lone Ranger. The mask amplifies the strongest, but also the ugliest aspects of the man underneath. And in Wade's case, it's unfaltering ferocity, but also a boundless sense of humor. He's playing a character. We see Wade in the quieter interstitial moments with Weasel, in the moments where he pines for Ness, and the less hostile conversations with Blind Al. You don't argue about IKEA furniture with people you hate. But still, he's rough on the people that are close to him, namely Blind Al. But he's also pretty callous with Weasel. More than that, his attempts to protect Ness are incredibly misplaced, which both hurts her emotionally and ultimately puts her in Francis's crosshairs. Wade's ugly on the outside, sure, but it's the ugly parts of his personality that spell difficulty for himself and others. The emotional depth of the film hinges on Wade's relationship to Ness, and it works well. If you've never had a high-grade traumatic experience, you still can care about these characters and can empathize with them. They're two people in love that would do anything for each other, and life, via cancer, torture, or whatever, is keeping them apart. But more than that, Wade's shame at his own ugliness is the main roadblock. As I said earlier, his blistered skin is shorthand for emotional scarring. This, of course, is a pretty common instinct of trauma survivors, believing they're too damaged, too broken, too shaken to ever be normal again, much less be loved. This is because love is seen as beautiful, and Wade is not. Ergo, Wade considers himself unlovable. Wade even says,
"Love is a beautiful thing."
This is in the opening minutes of the movie, but he's constantly dunking on himself for the rest of the runtime.
Like I got bit by a radioactive Shar-Pei. Belong in a fucking circus.
This shit.
I'm a monster inside and out.
This butterface.
This freak. I'm not making her life as ugly as mine.
This ain't a life worth living, is it?
Despite this, Wade doesn't just curl up and die, though. He does everything in his power to make something, anything happen. He propels himself forward for Vanessa's sake, even if he's still motivated partially by the idea of being cured or healed. Wade's assertion earlier is important. The worst part of trauma, much like cancer, is what it does to the people close to you. Wade's fear and desire to distance himself absolutely devastates Vanessa, but he genuinely believes he's making the right call. Pain can cloud our judgment, and we often end up hurting or endangering those we mean to protect, in addition to exacerbating the issues that we're struggling with. Adjacent to that point is Colossus and Negasonic. They're here coded as well-meaning friends who see the error in Wade's self-destructive actions. They try to intervene several times, but due to their perception of the situation, informed by the clean-cut black and white morality of the Gifted Youth program, they end up making Wade more frustrated. Their hearts are in the right place, sure, but they're mishandling a struggling person. Wade literally has to cut his own arm off in order to get away. I've definitely been in situations where people that were trying to help me were doing more harm than good. And yeah, I would have cut my own arm off too if it meant an end to it. But that being said, Wade eventually realizes that he can't do this alone. He doesn't turn to Weasel because Weasel's both dismissive of Wade's pain, a coward, and is also played by TJ Miller. He turns to Colossus and Negasonic because they've at least made it clear that they want to help him. Their intentions have been pure from the start, but it takes Wade formulating the plan and deciding what he wants and needs for them to be effective. Not everybody has the need to involve their friends in overcoming trauma, but it does help. If the victim can be open and honest and work with their support system, that's usually the simplest way to beat the bad guys. And yet, Wade is still acting as Deadpool around the two of them because it's safer for him. It's safer, or at least easier, to project his persona. He's not Deadpool, he's never Deadpool around Vanessa. He tries to approach her as himself a few times. He follows her as himself, he goes to the strip club as himself, but he can never fully reveal himself because to do so would expose Vanessa to the thick layer of ugliness he's now sustained. Revealing himself would require him to be vulnerable. When Ness removes Wade's mask, she's removing the Deadpool persona. This persona functions as a means to keep Wade detached, as I said earlier, and it's a means to distance himself from his issues. It's to prevent himself from being hurt again, but that persona also covers up the psycho-emotional wounds that he's sustained. Put simply, the removal of the mask in the final moments of the film is both Wade allowing himself to be vulnerable and honest about the extent of his suffering, and Ness declaring that no matter how grisly, deep-seated, or awful the damage done may be, she loves him as he is, not as he was. She loves him for what he means to her, not as a perfect person or a previous version of himself. He's been permanently scarred, but to Ness, it's nothing but a temporary stumbling block. He's still her Wade, ugly and all. She loves him, and in Deadpool, love really does conquer all. Love propels us to bond with like-minded individuals, to do the impossible, to escape, to fight, to respect ourselves. And that's the ultimate takeaway from the first Deadpool movie. Ugly does not equal unlovable. Ugly does not stop you from doing what's right, from protecting those you love, from fighting for yourself. Ugly can be tough, badass, unstoppable, mouthy, confident, but vulnerable and driven. Ugliness is not a bad thing. To be ugly, to be unfinished, unpolished, or damaged is to be human. But to overcome that ugliness and fight for your self-respect with the help of your friends, that's being a hero. Hey, Alden here. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. This really was a labor of love for me and obviously a very personal topic, so any kind of support really means a lot. If you like this video, please subscribe. I fully intend to make these video essays like a regular thing. I'm already working on more, actually, including one about Ghost of Tsushima, one on my personal favorite John Carpenter movie, and I'd also really like to do a sequel to this video discussing Deadpool 2. I hope you had a good time, and if you haven't already, please follow me on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram at Gonzo Capulet.